Hello and welcome to Integrity Radio, a platform where we talk about everything maritime. I am your host, Folashade Adiromu. On today's edition of the program, we'll be focusing on marine biodiversity and conservation. And to take us through the dialogue, I have with me Dr. Stella Egbe. She is the Species Conservation Manager, Nigerian Conservation Foundation. It's so good to have you join us today. Good.
Thank you very much.
Day, madam. All right, so for purpose of clarity and having a good understanding of what we are going to be talking about today, when we talk about the marine biodiversity, what should come to mind?
Okay, so the marine ecosystem is basically the water, our international waters, our oceans, our seas. And it is, the biodiversity is all forms of life that exist within it. Some people, technically you can say all forms of genetic resources. So from singular cells to huge mammals like whales.
Oh, okay.
So that is.
So the singular cells will mean
amoeba and things like that you cannot see with your eyes, to huge life forms like the blue whale, which is like the biggest mammal on Earth. Biodiversity also refers to the relationship among these organisms, some in competition, some mutualistic. That's all what we refer to as biodiversity, and the functions that they perform within themselves and the output of those functions and how it benefits every other thing within the entity of the ecosystem.
So encompassing, if you ask me. All right, so it's a well-known fact that Africa's seas and oceans are usually overlooked when it comes to issues of sustainable development in Africa. How do you think we can, begin to change this narrative? With so much happening around us today in the world, we're talking about climate change here, we're talking about fossil fuels somewhere else and all of that.
Yes, so for Africa, I think it's time for us to look at development alongside the conservation and preservation of our natural resources. Fortunately, we are not overexploited yet, so it's not too late to do something about it. But how are we utilizing these resources? Nigeria, for example, that our major economic stay is crude oil, and the largest deposits are under the sea. So you would hear repeated cases of oil spills, you hear repeated cases of pollution that affects not just the organisms, even the people that live within the proximity of these resources. There is the possibility to exploit resources in a sustainable manner that leaves the resources intact for future generation, that is beneficial to the people in the local communities, and is also beneficial to the government and even the international community. So we must explore sustainable exploitation of the resources.
But then when you look at it, we're talking about marine biodiversity and conservation. So these are two things. How do we make sure that they are able to work, together and one is not affected in any way?
Okay, so the interesting thing with especially in our rural coastal communities, is that they are very good with knowledge. They've been utilizing these things over the years, and sometimes you interact with them and then you find that they even know more than we feel we know. So we have to look at sustainability, not just in terms of what we're hearing from the first world or the international communities, but also combine it with the indigenous knowledge that has ensured that, for example, if you don't have things like oil spillage and all that, we might not have the amount of loss or declines that we already have. But that is not the only thing that is acting on marine biodiversity. We also have the issues of climate change. So we must find a way to create that balance that protects people and the resources that we have, especially as a country.
Let's look at the fact that this new administration, weeks back, surprised many Nigerians, because it looks like that's the word, with the introduction of that new ministry, the Ministry of Marine and Blue Economy. For someone in your own, specialty, and you have been in this industry for quite a while, how do you make of this announcement? Or to even start with, what was your reaction when this announcement came?
Yeah, it was quite surprising because for us, because we're a developing country, most of what we clamor for is economic development. Any focus on something that looks at the conservation or the exploitation of resources to bring economic benefits, but while protecting our natural resources, is not something we're always seeing. So it was an exciting news. And I think that if we go through with it with the intention and the goals that the government has spelled out that they want to achieve, if we follow through with it, it's going to be a huge plus for the government.
But from your experiences, I know you've been to many of these coastal communities and littoral states. You've seen some of the things they do there. What are, things that you are seeing that we need to begin to correct?
We already have overexploitation of our resources because people just want to feed, people want to eat. But there is a need to regulate and utilize resources in a way that is beneficial economically. And we need to exploit our resources beyond subsistence. Not just a fisherman going to pick 5 fishes and then there's a damage to the ecosystem while doing that. But exploiting in such a way that a country like Nigeria that has huge marine resources, huge coastline, can use these resources in a way that benefits the country. That becomes forex, for example, to the country, and it is very, very possible. And these are some of the things we want to do while we are protecting our resources, not just to eat them, but how about our tourism, our ecotourism, our biodiversity tourism? So these are some things that we need to include. Utilize our coastlines. You go to other coastal countries and you realize that the coastal areas are more populated. And that's because there's a lot going on. You have a lot of ecotourism activities going on. The thing with ecotourism is it takes nothing from communities. People traveling, look at these things.
Communities benefit on the other end.
Exactly. So these are some of the things. But beyond that, we're also looking at our crude oil exploitation activities that has caused a lot of damage in coastal areas, marine areas. And how do we now begin to take steps to correct errors that have been made in the past? When you seize a vessel, for example, why burn? In burning, you're not just punishing whoever you have caught, but you're also damaging the ecosystem. So that blue economy that we're beginning to push, a lot of things have to be corrected, and then before we begin to count our achievements.
I know since we started talking about this idea of the Ministry of Marine and Blue Economy, many have said that the idea of introducing the marine takes it to the science world. Is that what we are looking out to see? And again, the marine life, what do we have there? What's it all about?
When people look at it like that, they think it brings science in isolation of development. Okay. But if you look at Nordic countries, you look at Europe, science actually forms the core of development. The mainstream biodiversity conservation issues, you bring it into the economy, and then you realize that you are actually overlooking a great resources that you would have benefited from. So science is not an enemy of development, but it can be a pillar of development. So you have fishing, for example, you have large trawls running our waters. All of that fish, for example, we have the silver catfish in Nigeria is becoming endangered. You don't see them.
It looks like the last time I saw that was
exactly. And if you go to local communities, people will tell, "Oh, we know they see this thing again. We don't see this thing anymore," and they really can't relate. And the truth is this: it is not the person that is catching 2, 3, 4 that is causing the declines of those fishes. The unsustainable trawlers, for example. So we need to understand that this science is not the enemy, but science is saying use the information that is being provided to guide your economic policies. And because we are starting this ministry, it's good that we start knowing the risk of abusing our marine ecosystem would be.
So when we look at the status of Nigeria today, bringing it down to our marine biodiversity, how do you rate us as an expert?
So we're not doing badly, but this ministry is going to help bring what we're doing to the fore. What marine researchers, for example, are doing will come more to the fore and bring more attention to where we need interventions most. For example, we need to, as we're looking at the blue economy, where are the areas that we are going to focus resources on in terms of attracting investment. But again, we also need to focus on areas that are biological hotspots and then set those areas aside. Research should be the core map out areas that are important for biodiversity. But again, also there is the economy, because the marine ecosystem is not just habitat to fish, to turtles, and to all forms of life. It also has services that it provides. You and I breathe in oxygen.
Definitely.
Yeah? Oxygen comes from plants.
Okay.
Imagine that you had to pay for the oxygen. So sometimes to look at the value of natural resources, you may not be able to put an amount to it. We need to evaluate our resources based on the ecosystem service it provides, the food it provides, the cushioning effect it provides.
All right, so a report compiled by 145 experts authors from 50 countries, released by an intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, they confirmed that humanity is destroying its own life support system as the natural world faces unprecedented decline. How true is this, and what can we do?
The basis for such reports is tied to this ecosystem system services that I'm talking about. For example, you pollute your waters. It's coming back to you, not even to the future generation. Some of the damages that we're doing, we are going to face it firsthand, not even maybe 3 generations later. For example, you burn fossil fuel on water bodies, you destroy all forms of life in that area, and so you go to areas that naturally should be hotspots that people should be able to fish, drink water from, get other forms of resources, shrimps, and then you find out that they are barren because a chemical pollution has gone on and nothing is surviving. So you find communities that cannot farm, cannot fish, cannot get anything directly or indirectly. If you don't control what you're doing to your environment, we are damaging ourselves, and it's happening on a huge scale. When such reports are put together, they come from a whole lot of research that have been done in different parts of the world.
So when we are to embark on campaigns like that, where should be the focus?
I don't think we have to narrow it. A lot of people cannot relate their livelihoods or their well-being to the natural resources within their environment. So we need to upscale it to global, regional, and national levels. But we also need to work with coastal communities, particularly that depend primarily on the marine ecosystem for their survival. We need to work with them, raise awareness with them, because for them sometimes they notice what is not there, but they cannot link why it is not there. So what are some of the indicators they should know that something is wrong, for example? Apart from people, you also have other species you can use to tell that something has gone wrong in a place. Birds, for example.
Really?
You have birds that utilize areas of marine ecosystem, and when you don't see them flocking those areas anymore, it shows you that you are losing something, or they are sort of indicative of something going wrong in that area. And then people should also understand that it is not just those that are in close proximity to these marine resources that benefit from it.
So
even you that you are in the desert, you are benefiting from this. You might not be living in close proximity, but you're benefiting from it. So that is very important.
As it stands today, how do we begin to create pathways to bring in prevention, sustainability, conservation, like we have been talking about?
So I think that we're already doing that. First of all, we're already exploiting resources within our environment. So we already know that there is economic benefit. So the next phase is to exploit in a way that is beneficial to us, not just for today, but even for the future. It's constitutional. We need to enforce it. We need to learn it. We need to actually embrace better lifestyles. If we're doing something forever and we find out it is wrong, then we need to redirect our approach. Our world is changing. Extinction rates are high. There is the threat of climate change. It's not something to argue. There are evidences that these things are going on. So we need to, pollution of whatever kind, even plastic pollution, not just even the pollution at industrial scale.
It looks like we are beginning to curb the plastic pollutions.
Are we?
But with this, several incentives people are coming out with. The buying of plastics here and there. I think you are the one in that feedback.
I think that we are becoming more aware, but would
for Nigeria, when we get to the point where we are reducing from the source, then we'll
Okay.
begin to answer the question. If I keep buying the waste, you keep producing it. But if we need to direct our attention to the source, and that is key.
Are there policies or laws helping us protect our marine biodiversity in Nigeria at all?
That is the major question, and the answer is yes.
Oh, really?
Yes. So, even by the constitution, the government has the sole responsibility to protect not just people, but the natural resources. So, constitutionally, it is the role of the government, because we have a land use act, and if you hear about the government owns everything. So, if any entity, whether a person or an organization, is abusing the environment, it behoves on the government to ensure that that person is prosecuted, and whatever damage is being done to the environment is halted, and even mitigative measures. So primarily our constitution requires that the government does that. But apart from that, we also are signatories to a lot of international conventions. We have marine conventions for protection of biodiversity. We've signed a lot of conventions, convention of migratory species, for example, which we have some marine species that utilize our spaces. We have a convention that is supposed to we've signed into a convention that is supposed to prevent dumping of pollutants into our marine ecosystem. The next question now is, when you have an international convention, you need to find a framework to domesticate that convention. So, for example, we have the MASA.
Okay.
That is into...
Yeah, the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety.
Exactly. You also have NOSDRA.
Okay.
They look at all of this enforcement of pollution, especially by the marine, by the oil exploration activities and all that. But we also need to move beyond that to effective enforcement. We also need to look at how we're enforcing laws on unsustainable fishing. How effective are they? If you and I go to within our 5 nautical miles of our waters today, are we going to see these people monitoring these areas?
Presence.
So we need to ensure that those laws that we have, there is the effective enforcement of them.
So this effective enforcement now, some industry watchers will tell you, maybe with the participation of the private sector, we can have it done better. Do you think so?
Maybe, and I'm inclined to say yes, because private sector is profit driven. So anything that threatens that profit is taken seriously. So maybe yes, but the government needs to do more, because the private sector wants to make its money. It's investing, but it wants to make its money. But how about areas that do not benefit from private sector investment? Then government please, and those areas are more than the areas where you currently have, or even until we get to the peak where nobody's going to take over everywhere. There are still going to be free areas. There are going to be areas that belong to communities. They have their own rights as well. So government has to play a major role in ensuring that enforcement is key. Some local communities have their bylaws that help them protect. I know, for example, that there are areas in Nigeria that they have off fishing seasons.
Well, where's that?
For example, some parts of Bielsa,
really?
they have off fishing seasons, and that allows the fishes recover and all that.
And grow
So
the
exactly,
young ones.
yeah. So communities too play a role in doing that, and I think they exist in a whole lot of places, but we need to know what is going on there to say for sure.
All that you have mentioned, is my life threatened in any way? Like, do we have threats to human life?
Sure. Our food, we depend on the marine ecosystem for food, and all of the aquatic ecosystem is connected. So your inland water flows into the ocean, into the seas, and all that. They are connected. So what happens in one place can actually impact on a huge scale. So I'll create an analogy. So you have, for example, you pollute an area, and that is where a particular species of fish does its schooling of its eggs and all that. You pollute that area and the fish dies. All of that for that year is gone. So you know that you are not having anyone that will grow.
Come from that place.
Now here is the thing: when those fishes are swarming, there are people that depend, because people also, some fishermen know the seasons that, for example, sardines would lay the peak period of their breeding. They know that, but you clear a whole school for a season, and then your fishermen can get that. If you remember, like if you 2-3 years ago, there was a time it was difficult to get Titus fish.
Yes.
We don't know what was the reason, but you know that directly affected you and I. It can be as simple as that, but again, it even can be complex. You have cases where you have other forms of pollution, like agric waste, that leads to what is called eutrophication. So there is this pumping of resources, of nitrogenous resources into water, and then you have algal bloom. So the plants just take over the water. There is no balance in that case. There is shortage of oxygen. So even the other resources that depend on that ecosystem will suffer. So it can be as simple as a school of fish being deteriorated, but it can also be a complex effect on the food chain and the food web that we have in our marine ecosystem. There's been cases in some communities where people just saw fishes floating, and that's because there's been pollution somewhere, and water travels, of course, and it will carry. So, and you have some very bad cases where you've seen it in Nigeria. A shark or a whale washes up. We don't know what killed it, but people go on and
just kill and start dividing
eating and all that. And so this is a lot of education is needed. So what we normally encourage in conservation is not to say don't utilize this, but utilize it well. So if you're going to fish, what kind of fishing gear do you use? What sizes of fish do you catch? That is more effective. So if you don't catch all these babies that are supposed to grow and repopulate the ecosystem, things like that are some of the best ways to go about leading communities to be better managers of their natural resources.
Wow. All right. So far now, it's obvious that the nation will indeed benefit from these new ministries, talking about the Ministry of Marine and Blue Economy, but achieving, all of these benefits together, especially with the idea that it is a new ministry and we have new people coming on board as well, is something that still looks kind of big. So how do we make these look small?
The ministry will have to collaborate with national orientation agencies, collaborate with our schools. You have to educate people in the formal and informal sector. We also need to talk to people who are in tourism, marine tourism, for example.
Earlier we were talking about climate change, first of all. Now, marine biodiversity and conservation, are there in any, is there any relationship with these terms?
They are completely married. The distribution of biodiversity in our ecosystem, from marine to terrestrial, is also tied to global temperatures. As temperature increases, you're going to have less volume of oxygen in our waters. It's going to affect some species. There are thresholds that different organisms can withstand. Beyond those thresholds, they will die out. You're also going to have, in some places, increasing acidity. There's going to be a change in the chemical composition of waters when you have pollution. So everything is tied.
It's quite, it's quite educating, I must say. But even as we begin to, round off this conversation, for our coastal communities and littoral states that will still have in existing today, how do we make sure that in all of these communities like that don't just go into extinction?
When we find the benefits that local communities, these coastal communities, are supposed to get from the resources that are around them, but because of laws, it is government that can exploit those resources, we must ensure that those communities benefit from those resource exploration. That is the just thing that we can do, so that they are in the proximity to these things. They are like the primary caretakers of these resources. We work with local communities, marine coastal communities. One of the major things we're trying to do in recent times with other stakeholders in conservation is to begin to shine more light in biodiversity hotspots in our coastal environment. And then you carry out activities that ensure that people and those resources live in harmony. We do a lot of tree planting. Mangroves play a critical role in the marine biodiversity ecosystem, and we've been doing replanting of mangroves in parts of Bayelsa. We have offices in Calabar. We do monitoring of waterbeds, which are indicative of the changes that you have in coastal areas, and they help to tell us what is going on in those areas. So we do a lot of activities, really.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Dr. Stella Egbe, Species Conservation Manager, Nigerian Conservation Foundation, for being a part of our conversation today. Even as we are focused on marine biodiversity and conservation, it's so nice having you join us. All right, then. So we leave it at that today. Thank you so much. Fola Shadia Jerome is my name.